Hey everybody, welcome to another hand of the day review. This is hand 42 and it's going to be picking the right bet size against a fish. So in this hand, we're playing as big blind versus small blind, and this is somebody who has 30-10 VPIP PFR. They decided to open and then we called pre-flop. So the other note that we have is that they're a stationy fish who is able to call overbets light. They are also position aware, so they're probably opening a little bit more than 10% PFR from small blind specifically. We are holding queen 10 and we flop top pair. They actually decide to check on the flop, and then we decide to go for a 30% pot, and we're trying to figure out what is the best bet size that we can use on the turn. So I pulled over here and I asked people what they would choose between 75% pot to 250% pot, and it looks like the middle answer is going to be somewhere just under 150% pot because there's more people who voted 100% than 200%. So on average, people said it was going to be around 130% pot, with 150 being the most common answer. I think there's a lot of value in understanding just how big we can value bet against fish. The reason why is because a very substantial chunk of our win rate comes from getting called light against fish. And although this player isn't super wise, right, they're only playing 30-10 preflop, there's still very useful concepts that we can learn from this specific situation that is going to apply when we're playing against much wider fish. Let's go ahead and jump into the solver and illustrate a few different concepts that are going to help us figure out what the best bet size is going to be here, and also in a few similar spots. So I have 4 different sims prepared, and 2 of them are going to be when our opponent has a tighter range, and then 2 of them are going to be when our opponent has a wider range. In all of these sims, I've limited the turn bet size options to just 2. So in this one, it's 100% pot and 200% pot. And the reason why is because we're just going to do a little bit of modeling to try to get some general estimates for what the optimal bet size would be. There are a few notes that are worth discussing. So first of all, as I already mentioned, this is somebody who is opening 10% of hands overall, and they are position sensitive. There's going to be some fish who are position insensitive and they're opening much, much wider. But here it's somebody who is going to open a little bit wider from later positions. But because the overall stat is quite low, we're just going to give them a range of 15 to 20% hands, as we can see here. It might be a little bit wider, and obviously it's probably going to look different, right? It doesn't really matter too much. Again, I'll show you later on what everything looks like when the ranges are significantly wider. And then we'll just use this as the tighter option and the other one as the wider option to see where a good middle ground would be realistically. So that's the first thing worth mentioning. The second concept worth noting is that when fish check on the flop, they're not actually going to be very capped. I think it's a common misconception for people to think that the player is never going to hold strong hands after they check. There are definitely very many trappy fish. And when you take a step back and you just look at data, they're not going to be capped unless they check twice in a row. It's very similar to regs. Of course, these players are going to vary a little bit based on their individual tendencies and playstyle. So if you have a read that somebody is a bit more trappy, then that's definitely something that's going to affect your turn bet size as well. But if we don't have that read, or if it's just an ambiguous situation, assume that they're only going to be a tiny bit more capped than the solver. The solver, by the way, wouldn't really check very often if we give it this range against our GTO calling range, which I didn't adjust because there's not really a point. So I did node lock this player to check 20% of the time, just so we have some meaningful strategy to look at on the turn. So those are 2 big things that we want to keep in mind when we're playing against fish overall. The third one is that fish will be less flexible against different bet sizes compared to the solver. Regs in general are going to respond a little bit less flexible than the solver, which just means that when players are facing different bet sizes, they'll be a bit more binary with certain decisions, like bluff catching, right? Like the solver is going to be very sensitive if you use 250% pot or 300% pot, but regs will be a little bit less sensitive, and fish will be even less sensitive compared to regs. So that's one of the things that we're going to model, and that's why we only did 2 bet sizes, so that we can try to do that effectively without overcomplicating things. This is the solver strategy. So firmly, this hand is not strong enough to go for a 200% pot if we just give it the parameters that we did. You can see that there's a very clear EV difference between those 2 bet sizes, and 100% pot seems like it's closer to the optimal size for this specific hand. I think this makes a lot of sense when you take a look at the opponent's response versus the 200% bet size. I don't want to elaborate on it too much, but essentially we're just isolating ourselves up against stronger top pairs, over pairs, but we're still sometimes getting called with some of the 7x. Again, it doesn't really matter because the specific range that we're looking at is going to be very different from what the fish has in game. But the key point is that the solver is not calling with enough weaker hands like pocket 9s and pocket 8s, which are definitely going to be in the opponent's range at a substantial frequency. Those hands would call against 100% pots, so that's why that size is preferred. But let's take a quick look at what happens when our opponent decides to call overbets light. In this sim, I node lock the opponent to overcall by around 13% versus the big overbet, and I also made them overcall by around 10% versus the 100% pot size bet. And the fact that they're overcalling a little bit more against the bigger bet is meant to sort of mimic the inflexibility that many fish will have. Essentially, if they're holding something like pocket 9s or pocket 8s, they're going to make their decision largely based on vibes, right? They're going to think to themselves, is this somebody who likes to bluff? Is this not somebody who likes to bluff? It's going to be a very binary decision for them. Now, obviously, don't take this to the extreme. People are going to respond very differently versus tiny bets like 30% pot compared to massive bets like 300% pot. So it's all about the extent to how binary they are, if that makes sense. Also note that the overpairs aren't a massive chunk of this player's range, but if we are up against somebody who likes to slow play those hands and we have that specific read on them, then that is going to affect our bet size dramatically. You can see that pocket 9s and pocket 8s are a very big chunk of the range. So if queens and jacks were definitely in there at a similar frequency, that is going to make us want to bet significantly smaller. But just given this overcall, here's what we can expect. Queen 10 does become strong enough to use the big bet, and this is now the preferred size compared to 100% pot. Even something like Jack 10 is able to go for 200% pot, which is very, very big. And I think this is maybe a little bit extreme. So that's our first set of sims. That's when our opponent has a very tight range. But now I want to show you guys what it looks like when our opponent has a very wide range. And that's going to teach us a concept that is going to apply to situations where we're playing against a wide fish, but it's also going to have some very interesting takeaways for this specific situation. Let's go ahead and look at it. So same idea, we're just starting off with the solution. Do note that I'm using 150% pot and 300% pot as the two bet sizes now, instead of 100 and 200. In this case, I gave our opponent the GTO preflop opening range, so this is a fairly wide range. If the solver only has these two options, Queen 10 doesn't really like either of them, it's overplaying its strength a little bit, and yeah, it would definitely prefer something closer to 100% pot if you gave it that option. But now here's the fun part. So if we node lock our opponent to overcall against the 300% pot size bet, you'll notice that the solver still doesn't prefer to use that size when it's holding Queen 10. Certain combos are definitely strong enough to bet, but it's just a little bit too big for this hand, even if our opponent has a very wide range. There are obviously some caveats here. One of them is the fact that because our opponent has a wider range, they're actually structuring their calling range against the overbet a bit differently, right? They're not calling with pocket 9s and pocket 8s anymore. They're instead preferring hands like 7x. That's going to affect the output a little bit, and if we are truly playing against somebody who is a massive station, and they're not folding their 7x or their pocket 9s or pocket 8s, then this size is probably going to be optimal. But at the same time, we can't really be sure that they're never going to hold any of these stronger hands, so we can probably say that 300% pot is going to be too big, even if they have a very wide range. So putting both of these things together, I think a good bet size for something like Queen 10 is going to be maybe 160 to 175% pot. It just seems like a pretty good middle ground between the two solutions, and from this one we can learn that a very big bet size of 300% pot or more is not going to be correct, but from the previous one we can learn that it's very easy for us to get to around 2x pot. There is one important theoretical concept here, and that is the fact that for our hand to use a very, very big bet size, it has to have close to 100% equity. In other terms, as our hand approaches 100% equity, the preferred bet size for that hand is going to increase exponentially. This means that if our hand has something like 80% equity, it's only going to want to use around 75% pot, and maybe it only goes up to around 100% pot if our hand has 90% equity. But when we go from 90 to 95 or 95 to 100, it skyrockets from 100% to 200% to 300%, all the way up until we're putting our entire stack in, no matter how big it is. That's very oversimplified because in poker we have blockers and we have balance, but this concept just demonstrates that when we're holding a hand that's clearly not super strong, we don't want to get way ahead of ourselves and bet for all these massive 300% pot overbets. 175% pot seems more than fine, and then on the river we can reassess and choose the best bet size according to the situation. So definitely don't be afraid to get value, but also don't overplay your hand. I hope you guys enjoyed this analysis. I think this sort of comparison was quite insightful for me at least, and I will see you guys in the next one.